She had been invisible for so long she had nearly stopped minding it. The women of Harlan Crossing looked through her at church, past her at the mercantile, and around her on every road she walked alone. She had exactly 9 days before the room above the tanner's shop was let to someone else, and she had nowhere left to go. The man who came to her with an offer was not kind about it. He was not even polite, but he was honest. And in her experience, honesty was rarer and worth more than either. This is not a story about a woman who was finally seen. It is a story about a woman who was always worth seeing, and what happened when one stubborn, grief-hollowed rancher who had been alone long enough to forget what company felt like finally looked up from his land and found her standing at his gate. The ink on the notice had faded, but the words had not. Maren Voss read them a second time, not because she had misunderstood them, but because she wanted to be certain she had not invented comfort that was not there. Ranch hand, wanted. Capable individual, Harlan Crossing area. Inquire at the Cold Creek Ranch. Ask for Cole Daughtry. No mention of wages, no mention of lodging, no mention of what capable meant to a man who ran cattle alone on 400 acres with a drought entering its second summer and a mortgage that the land itself seemed to be trying to repay by sheer exhaustion. She folded the notice into her coat pocket and walked to the edge of the tanner's narrow staircase and looked at the room she had occupied for 11 months. A rope bed, a tin wash basin, a window that faced the alley. She had paid for it by keeping books for 3 of the town's merchants until 2 of them decided her presence in their shops made their wives uncomfortable, and the third decided he could manage the sums himself and save the coin. 9 days. She put on her better coat, which was the same coat she always wore, only brushed, and walked the 2 miles to Cold Creek Ranch in the morning before the heat had fully arrived. The gate was iron, which surprised her. Most ranches this size used wood. The iron was old and the paint had gone entirely, but someone had welded a cracked hinge back together with evident care, and the gate swung smooth. A man who repaired what he had rather than replacing it. She noted that. Cole Daughtry was splitting wood behind the barn when she came through the yard. He was broader than she had expected, and he worked with the focused efficiency of a man who had long since stopped thinking about the labor and simply performed it. He did not look up when she stopped 10 feet away. "I'm here about the notice," she said. He set the axe in the block and straightened and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had prepared himself for disappointment and was now deciding whether this qualified. "You're Maren Voss," he said. It was not a question. "I am. The widow. For 3 years now." He studied her for a moment. He had gray in his dark hair at the temples and a scar along his jaw that had healed badly, as frontier scars did, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, neither brown nor green, something between. He did not look like a man who smiled easily. He looked like a man who had been alone long enough that the habit of company had worn away entirely, leaving something harder and quieter in its place. "Everybody in town said you'd come," he said. "They said I shouldn't hire you." Maren kept her voice even. "And yet you posted the notice. I need someone who can work. I don't need someone the town approves of. Those 2 things don't often overlap." He picked up the axe again. "What can you do?" she told him. Not modestly, because modesty was a luxury she had spent down to nothing. She told him she could keep a ledger, manage a household account against a creditor's list, assist in difficult livestock births, because she had grown up on her father's cattle farm in Missouri before coming west with her husband, who had died of fever before he managed to prove their claim. She told him she could work from sunrise to dark without complaint, and that she required a room, meals, and a wage she named plainly, which was fair by any measure. He did not speak while she gave him all of this. When she finished, the yard held the particular stillness of a hot morning with no wind. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted. The smell of dry hay and sun-baked wood came to her through the warmth. "The town thinks you're bad luck," he said. "The town thinks women without husbands are bad luck," she said. "I have found that to be a matter of their comfort, not mine." Something moved in his face, not a smile, not close to one, but something that had not been there a moment before. "The room is in the house," he said. "Back of the kitchen. It locks from the inside." "I'll need to see the ledgers before I can tell you where the money's going," she said. "The money's going to Jonas Heel," he said. "He holds the mortgage, 3 payments behind. He's been extending terms, but he won't do it again. 6 weeks until September 1st. Then show me the ledgers, she said. He led her inside without another word. The kitchen was large, by frontier standards, and scrubbed to a cleanliness she had not expected from a man living alone. The iron stove was cold, but the hearth had been swept. There was a row of tin cups on iron hooks, and the window above the basin looked out to the pasture, where a thin herd stood in the shade of a single cottonwood, heads down against the heat. Cole Daughtry set a battered ledger book on the table and went back outside. Marin sat down, removed her gloves, and opened it. The numbers told a story she had read before in other men's accounts. Not a hopeless story, but close. 3 seasons of poor rainfall had compressed the herd from 80 head to 52. Feed costs had climbed. A fence repair in spring had taken money that should have gone toward the mortgage. And there, in the last column, in tighter ink than the rest, J. Heel, additional terms conditional on full payment by September 1st. She was still reading when Cole came back in for water. He stood by the basin and looked at her across the table. "Well," he said. "The fence repair was necessary," she said. "But you overpaid the lumber merchant by $11.40. There is a mill at Deering, 14 miles east, whose rate is lower even accounting for freight. It is listed in the Territorial Agricultural Circular. The shortfall to Heel is not insurmountable if the fall sale brings fair price and no further costs land between now and September. I need 3 days with the full accounts to give you the exact number." He looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He took it back without asking permission, which she had expected. He closed it and set it on the shelf above the stove. "Supper is your department," he said, "not mine." "That is an acceptable arrangement," she said. He walked back outside. She heard the axe resume. She had been hired. She did not think he had said so directly, but she had been hired. The room behind the kitchen was small and smelled of cedar. A fresh candle sat on the shelf above the narrow bed. She did not know if Cole had placed it or if it had simply been there. She told herself the origin did not change its usefulness and unpacked her bag with the calm efficiency of a woman accustomed to making a strange room her own. Later, setting the stove for supper, she heard horses arrive in the yard, not Cole's, and then a voice she recognized, smoother through walls than it was in the open air of the mercantile. Jonas Heel. She stayed at the kitchen window. Heel's voice was land salesman cordial, and it covered the usual ground. Payment schedules, extended terms, and then ended with, "And that Voss woman in your house won't do you any favors with the bank, Daughtry. Men who associate with trouble inherit it. Word to the wise." A silence. Then, Cole's voice, short as a struck match. "The books are square. That's the only association the bank needs to know about." Hoofbeats departing. Marin turned from the window and built the fire, and if her hands moved steadily through the work, that was a discipline she had earned over years. She had no intention of spending it on Jonas Heel. 3 days passed in the pattern that working arrangements settle into when neither person has energy left for performance. Cole rose before light and was in the barn or pasture before she had the stove hot. She left his breakfast in the warmer and ate standing at the window, watching the early sky move from ash to copper over the fence line. She spent mornings on the accounts, afternoons on whatever needed doing, which was everywhere. The kitchen garden strangled with weeds, the back fence needed restringing, and the tack room organized according to no system she could identify until she understood there was no system, and Cole simply knew where everything lived by memory. She reorganized it on the second day while he rode the east pasture. Men who lived alone often received the rearrangement of their spaces as a kind of intrusion. She had braced for it. He came in that evening, went to the tack room, and found the halter he needed in under 5 seconds. He said nothing about it. But at supper, the first time they had eaten simultaneously at the same table, he passed her the bread without being asked. In the particular economy of Cold Creek Ranch, she understood that to be the equivalent of a spoken word. On the 4th morning, she found him at dawn standing over a young heifer at the near fence with the controlled dread of a man watching something he could not afford to lose. She climbed through the fence rails without hesitating. The animal's eyes were glassy, its breathing shallow and rapid. "How long?" she said. 20 minutes. She ran her hands along the heifer's side and pressed at the rumen. Bloat. She straightened and looked at Cole. "I need the trocar from the tack room," she said. "Left side, 3rd hook, canvas roll." He was already moving. He had not paused to question her, had not stopped to measure whether she knew what she was talking about. He had simply gone. She worked quickly. The procedure was unpleasant but not difficult if you had done it before, and she had done it before, on her father's farm at 16, when he had stood back and let her manage it because he had seen in the way she moved around animals a quality of calm attention they could feel. The heifer steadied. The pressure released. Cole stood 2 feet back in the fence-line grass and watched without speaking. When it was done, Maren wiped her hands on the rag from her coat pocket and looked at him. "She'll need watching today, and check the rest of the herd. If one has it, others may be close." He looked at the heifer. He looked at Maren. The expression on his face was one she would learn. Not gratitude, not surprise, but something more internal and more unresolved than either. The look of a man revising a judgment he had already made and finding the revision costly. "You've done that before," he said. "My father raised cattle. He believed in teaching what he knew to whoever was willing to learn." Cole nodded once. "I'll ride the herd this morning." "I'll come," she said. "I want to see the east pasture condition. The grass data in the ledger doesn't match what I see from the kitchen window." They rode in the early silence, horses moving at an easy pace through grass that was thin but not entirely lost. Maren stopped twice to crouch and press her fingers into the soil, reading the moisture below the surface, the way her father had taught her before she had known there were women who were not supposed to do such things. Cole watched both times without comment. He had stopped commenting on things she did that he had not anticipated. That was its own kind of shift. She straightened from the second spot and shaded her eyes to look north. "There's moisture running underground in this section. The surface reads dry, but 3 inches down it's different. Move the herd here for the next 10 days, rest the south pasture, and you'll bring them to the fall sale in better condition than the drought suggests is possible." A pause. "The south pasture has better shade. The south pasture has better shade, worse root moisture, and the cattle have been grazing it to bare ground for 2 months because it's the easiest section to watch from the barn." She looked at him without apology. "I am not criticizing. I am reading the land." He looked north to where she had pointed. "Move them tomorrow," he said. It was her conclusion delivered in his voice. She counted that. That evening, Birch Calloway rode over from the neighboring property, a man with the easy manner of someone who had no enemies left to make, and shook Cole's hand and looked at Maren with open curiosity that was neither rude nor unwelcome. "This your new hire?" Calloway said. "Maren Voss," Cole said. "Not your new hire. Her name." Calloway touched his hat brim. "Ma'am, I kept books for 1 season myself. Lasted 3 weeks before I gave it back to my wife. I heard you kept Alderman's accounts in order for nearly a year. He was sorrier than he let on when he let you go." He left an hour later with a promissory note for 3 fence posts he'd borrowed in spring, and when the yard went quiet again, Maren was at the dish basin, and Cole came in from the porch and stood in the doorway. "Calloway is right that Alderman was a fool," he said. "That is a generous thing to say." "It's accurate," he said. "Not the same thing." He went to bed. She finished the dishes in the last of the lamplight and thought that accuracy, in her experience, was its own form of generosity. She had simply never been the recipient of it before. This is Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live. Women who were handed nothing and made something from it anyway. Men who didn't know what they'd been missing until it walked through their gate without waiting to be invited. If that is the kind of story you want in your life, subscribe now. We will be right here when you come back. By the end of the second week, she had compiled Cold Creek's full financial position and laid it out for Cole at the kitchen table with the plain clarity she had always preferred over softened versions delivered by people afraid of the truth. The news was not good, but it was not final. If the fall sale brings the market rate on 40 head and you hold the 12 youngest for next season's herd, we reach this number. She set her finger on the figure. That is what Heel needs to extend without adding conditions. Cole looked at the page for a long time. "If," he said. "3 of the 4 conditions are nearly certain. The 4th is Jonas Heel." She looked at him directly. "He has been acquiring mortgages east of town. I believe this ranch is the last parcel in that corridor he does not hold, which means September 1st is not about collecting a debt." Cole's jaw set. "It's about manufacturing a reason to foreclose." "Yes." She had believed this since the first morning with the ledger, but had not said it until she was certain. "I intend to write to the Territorial Land Office. There are regulations on predatory mortgage acquisition. If his chain of title on any of those eastern properties carries an irregularity in its filing, that takes time. It takes the time it takes. But we begin now." She had the letter half drafted when the heavy wagon came fast into the yard. Jonas Heel dismounted with a man she did not know who carried himself like hired authority, the particular set of a man paid to stand close and say nothing until he was needed. The stranger tied both horses to the post with the practiced indifference of someone who had done this at many gates before this one and expected to do it at many more. Cole came from the barn at the same moment, wiping his hands on a rag, and his jaw set in the way she had come to recognize, the look of a man who had been expecting a thing and was now watching it arrive. He did not hurry across the yard. He did not slow down either. He covered the distance at exactly the pace of a man who would not be made to feel rushed on his own land. Heel was 50, pink-faced, dressed in town clothes that had never known a day's labor, the kind of man who had learned early that other people's labor was more profitable than his own and had organized his entire life around that discovery. He stopped in the center of the yard and looked at Cole first, briefly, and then his eyes moved to Marn and stayed there with an expression she had seen on him before. Proprietary and dismissive at once, as though her presence here offended him precisely because he had not arranged it, as though a woman who acted on her own judgment was a form of disorder that needed correcting. The hired man drifted 2 steps to the left without being told, positioning himself. Marn noted it and said nothing. "Daughtry," Heel said, returning his gaze to Cole with the manner of a man concluding that the woman was not worth addressing directly. "I've come about the September terms. There's been a change." "There is no change," Cole said. "The terms are written. The terms are subject to my judgment of your ability to meet them." A pause. His eyes moved back to Marn. He used a word, not her name, not any name. The kind of word men of a certain type kept sharpened and ready for women who would not arrange themselves to their convenience. A word designed not to wound so much as to reduce, to remind a woman in front of witnesses that she could be made small if the man in question decided to make her so. It landed in the yard between them, and the air around it went very quiet. The hired man looked at the ground. Cole took 1 step forward. Marn said, "Mr. Heel." Her voice was entirely level. Both men looked at her, Cole with his jaw still set and something behind his eyes that was beyond anger into the territory of cold intention, and Heel with the reflexive attention of a man who had been addressed unexpectedly by someone he had already dismissed. She reached into her coat pocket. Not for the letter she had been drafting to the land office that morning. That letter was not finished, and she did not deal in unfinished work. But for a document she had been composing for 3 days, assembled in the early mornings before Cole rose by lamplight at the kitchen table, precisely because she had understood from the first week that this morning was not a question of whether, but of when. She unfolded it with the unhurried care of a woman who knows the weight of what she is holding. "I have here a formal accounting of the mortgage transaction between your lending operation and the previous holder of this deed." Her voice carried across the yard without effort, calm as arithmetic, clear as a figure written in ink. "I have the name and contact of the Territorial Land Commissioner, to whom I have already sent a preliminary inquiry regarding the conditions under which you acquired 4 of the 6 adjacent properties in the past 18 months. I have also written to the Deering National Bank, which holds your operating line of credit, to request a routine inquiry into your current acquisition activities. Such inquiries are a matter of public commercial record. They require no special standing to initiate." She looked at him directly. "They do, however, require responses." Heel's color changed, not slowly. The smoothness left his voice like water leaving a dry creek bed. "This is not your concern. I am the account manager of Cold Creek Ranch," she said. "Every contract affecting this property is my concern. Everyone." Birch Calloway had appeared at the fence line. She had not heard him arrive. He stood with his arms folded on the top rail and watched with the quiet attention of a man who intended to remember everything he saw. Heel looked at Calloway. He looked at Cole. He looked at Marn one final time with an expression that had shifted from dismissal into something considerably less comfortable. He got back in his wagon. The hired man followed. They left at a pace that was not composed. Calloway said from the fence, "I'd say that went about as well as it could." Cole did not respond to Calloway. He was looking at Marin. She could read his expression clearly now, and it made something unsteady move through her chest. Not gratitude, not surprise, but a quality of attention she had not been given in a very long time. "Marin," he said. Her name. The first time he had used it, the weight of it in his voice was not ordinary. "You had that letter ready," he said. "For 3 days," she said. "I knew he would come." He stood in the yard with the morning sun behind him and looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Come inside. I'll make the coffee." The first time he had made anything in her presence, she followed him in. "Tell me," when she pulled that letter from her coat and heel went quiet. "Did you feel the shift then, or had you felt it coming long before that yard? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. Now, back to the story." They worked at the kitchen table for 4 hours that afternoon, the land office letter growing to 3 pages with her documentation attached, and the silence between them was not empty. It had weight and warmth, and the particular quality of a silence that belongs to 2 people who have stopped pretending they are strangers. That evening, Calloway came back with his wife, Nora, broad-shouldered, gray-streaked, with the direct gaze of a woman who had long since stopped performing opinions she did not hold. She brought a covered dish and set it on Cole's table without asking, and looked at Marin with steady warmth. "I've been wanting to meet you for 2 weeks, Nora said. "Birch says you reorganized the tack room." "I did." "Good." She sat down. "Cole has been losing hours to that room for years. Sit, both of you. This food is hot." They ate and the kitchen was warm, and Nora talked easily about the eastern pasture and the fall sale prices, and a neighbor woman 3 miles north who had taken ill. And when the men stepped outside briefly to look at Calloway's lame horse by lantern light, Nora leaned across the table and said quietly, "He has not had anyone at that table in 2 years, not a soul who stayed past an hour." She looked at Marin without sentiment. "I am not telling you what to do with that information. I am only telling you it is true." Marin said nothing. She looked at the empty doorway where Cole had been standing. "He will not say it first," Nora said. "That is simply who he is. You will need to decide whether that matters." After the Calloways had gone, Cole cleared the table and Marin washed the dishes. He dried them, the first time, and placed them on the shelf with careful attention. "Heel will try again," she said. "I know. But the land office inquiry will slow him. If there is an irregularity in his filing chain, and I believe there is, it will occupy him well past September 1st. Either way, with the sale, we can make the payment and give him no grounds." She turned from the basin and looked at him. "Either way, I believe we hold this land." He looked at her, the dish still in his hand, the last of the lamplight warm between them. "We," he said quietly. She had said it without deciding to. "The ranch," she said. He set the dish on the shelf. "Marin." The second time. Different from the first. Fuller, as though he had been holding the word and had finally stopped holding it. "I'm not a man who explains himself." "I know," she said. "I don't want this to be only an arrangement," he said. "I don't know how to say that better than that." She thought of what Nora had told her. She thought of the gate with its welded hinge, the candle on the shelf, the coffee he had made that morning for the first time. "I don't want it to be only that either," she said. He raised his hand. She saw him raise it, and he nearly set it to her face, to her jaw, and then he stopped. Lowered it, looked at his own hand as though it had surprised him. She reached out and took it, her fingers around his. His hand was rough with years of work, and she held it without hesitation and looked up at him. He said her name a third time. Quiet as a decision made and kept. She did not let go. The letter from the Territorial Land Office arrived 11 days later. There was an irregularity. Not large enough to unseat a man overnight, not the kind of thing that ends in a courtroom in a week, but large enough to generate official correspondence, which generated a documentation summons, which generated delay, and for Jonas Heel in the weeks before September 1st, delay was the one thing he could not absorb. A man whose entire strategy depended on a precise calendar could not afford to spend those weeks answering letters from the Territorial Land Office while his operating line of credit sat under the quiet scrutiny of a bank that had not previously been given reason to look closely. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the same postal rider who brought the feed circulars, indifferent to its own importance in the way that consequential things often are. Cole read it at the kitchen table. He read it a second time with the particular stillness of a man who has been braced for bad news for so long that good news takes a moment to resolve into something he can trust. He set it down on the table between them. "You knew," he said. "I believed," she said. Knowing required the letter. He looked at her. "How did you find it?" The dates on his original filing were 2 days before the territorial recording office was established in this county. Any acquisition made in that window had to be filed in Deering, not here. He filed locally. It is the kind of error a man makes when he is moving fast and assumes no one is reading carefully behind him. She kept her hands folded on the table. "The record is public. Anyone could have found it." "No one did," he said. "No one looked." A pause. "I rode to the county recorder's office the morning you went north to check the fence." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood, and the leaves caught it and turned it into something that sounded almost like water. "You borrowed the bay," he said. "I hoped that was acceptable." He looked at her with an expression that had nothing guarded left in it. "It was acceptable," he said, and the way he said it carried the full weight of everything he did not append to it, the gratitude he would not perform, the relief he would not announce, the particular regard of a man who has spent years respecting competence above everything else, and has finally found it in a place he had not thought to look. He picked the letter up and read it a third time. Then he set it on the shelf above the stove, next to the ledger, and went outside without another word. She heard him at the woodpile for a long time afterward, steady and rhythmic, the sound of a man working off something that had lived in his chest for months and was only now beginning to loosen. The fall sale came 3 days later. 41 head. Cole had refused to sell the heifer from the fence line grass, and she had not argued with him about it. She understood the refusal without needing it explained. Some debts are kept differently than others. The price was not ideal. The drought had pressed the market, and every rancher in the county was selling into the same compressed numbers. But it was not ruinous, and Maren had known before they loaded the wagon that morning that it would be enough, because she had run the figures the night before by lamplight, and the figures did not lie. When Cole looked at her from across the sale rail, she nodded once, before the auctioneer had finished calling the final number, and watched the tension leave his shoulders in a way that was almost visible, like a rope cut. He let out a breath long enough to have been held for months. They did not speak much on the way back from the sale. There was a quality to the silence between them that had changed over the weeks, less like two people avoiding something, and more like two people who had earned the right to be quiet together. The light went flat and orange across the plains, and the smell of early autumn came down cold and clean from the north, and the horses moved at an easy pace toward home. At the sale yard gate, before they had mounted to leave, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt stepped deliberately into their path. She kept the dry goods counter at the mercantile, and she had been among the first to stop requesting Maren's bookkeeping services 14 months ago, citing no reason beyond a vague dissatisfaction that everyone in town had understood to mean something else entirely. She was a small woman with precise opinions, and she had spent 2 years ensuring those opinions about Maren Voss were known in tones calibrated to carry just far enough to be useful and not so far as to require ownership. She looked at Maren now with an expression that was not warm and was not hostile, but was careful, the look of a woman in the process of revising her public record before someone else revised it for her. She looked at Maren now with an expression that was not warm and was not hostile, but was careful, the look of a woman revising her public record before it could be revised for her. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "I heard what you did with Heel's filing." A pause. "That was sharp work." Maren looked at her evenly. "It was accurate work," she said, "not the same thing." Mrs. Pruitt's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. She stepped aside and said nothing further. 2 men near the fence who had watched the exchange looked at each other and then looked away. A ranch hand Maren did not know touched the brim of his hat as she passed. Nobody in the yard said a word against her. Nobody looked through her. Nobody looked past her. Cole rode up beside her on the road home and said nothing about what had just happened. He did not need to. At the Cold Creek gate, the iron gate with the welded hinge she had noted on her very first morning, Cole dismounted and held it open, and she rode through and stopped and looked back at him standing in the frame of his own land. The light was going orange and flat over the plains, the cottonwood at the far fence beginning to turn, the sky moving toward evening with the unhurried certainty of a sky that has room to move. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "I want to ask you to stay." He said it plainly, without decoration. "Not because of the books, not because of Heel, because this place is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and I have not said that kind of thing to anyone in a long time, and I do not intend to say it to anyone else." The plains spread wide and still around them. The heifer she had saved stood at the near fence watching them with the patient attention of an animal that has been handled gently and knows it. "I'll stay," she said, "plain as water, true as land." He closed the gate behind them and walked to where she sat on the bay and took her hand, her right hand, the one that held the ledger pen, the one that had done every piece of work this ranch had asked of her, and held it. Not like a man requesting permission, like a man who had made a decision he intended to honor for the rest of his life. They walked toward the house in the last of the light, and the kitchen window threw a warm square of amber onto the yard, and the iron gate held firm behind them, and the plains went quiet in the way they do when something has been settled. She had come here with 9 days left and a brushed coat, and no one in town willing to look at her directly. She left the sale yard with a woman who had dismissed her speaking carefully and men who had ignored her stepping aside, and she rode home, and it was home now, she knew that, to a man who had stopped surviving alone because she had stopped surviving alone, and neither of them had needed to make a performance of it. The town would talk. The town always talked, but the town had learned today what Cole had learned in a fence line at dawn with his hands empty and his heifer failing, that Maren Voss was not a woman you overlooked twice. She came with 9 days left and a coat that had been brushed to look like her better coat. She came because a man posted a notice and she answered it, and no one else did. She left the sale yard with a woman who had once dismissed her, now choosing her words with care, and she rode home, and it was home now, that was simply true, to a man who had stopped surviving alone because she had, and neither of them had needed to make a performance of it. The town would go on talking. The town always did. But it would talk differently now, and everyone in Harlan Crossing who had looked through Maren Voss for 3 years would spend some portion of the coming winter remembering the morning Jonas Heel drove out of Cold Creek Ranch without a word, and without what he had come for. That was enough. That was more than enough. Next week, a woman named Ruth steps off a stage in Colton Wells carrying a deed to a property she has never seen, and a name she was told belonged to a dead man. Only the man answers the door himself. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens the moment she raises her hand to knock and the door opens before she does.